Hey classes, welcome back. We're in the hat today because of Indiana Jones. Actually, Mr. Westbrook across the hall is the one who really rocks the Indiana Jones look. But we're going to talk about this particular scene in one of the later Indiana Jones movies and how it's kind of where they jumped the shark on the Indiana Jones franchise. But still, if you check it on out at the beginning of this particular movie, you see him in a town that was built in the Nevada desert, but it was inhabited all by mannequins, and they had a whole house set up. And he thinks, as he's running from the bad guys, I'm safe, there's a town. But then he comes to realize very quickly that it's a nuclear test site. Yes, they actually used to do that out in the Nevada desert in the air. They still do it underground. Back when I worked in a museum in college, we had a seismograph that would detect when the nuclear tests were happening out in the Nevada desert. Fortunately, they don't do it in the air anymore because it would poison things from miles downwind of where the test particularly happened. But if you check out this particular scene, this comes into play in the last little part of Twisting the Dragon's Tail, an absolutely excellent documentary. We're not seeing the whole thing, but little pieces of it because it has to do with radioactive isotopes. We're focusing on uranium in this one, their effect on biology. And here's a quick recap of where we've been and where we're going. So here we go. If you look at the notes today, they look something like this. We had a brain pop that had to go with genetic mutations. Now remember, we're getting into the biology, but we start with atoms, then molecules, and a little bit about radioactive decay. Now radioactive decay is a hard concept. We don't go too deeply into it, but we do have to at least recognize the elements that are radioactive and the general shape of the graph when we're looking at a decay curve, we call that. So to that end, we were talking a little bit about cell division. Now, if you're looking at the most basic cell that we're going to be starting the class with in Chapter 4, talking about cells, we're talking about a bacteria cell. The other day, Monday in here, we had some lipids floating in a glass of water, some oil floating in water. This helped us get to the properties of water too, by the way. And when you're looking at a cell, the outer layer of the cell, they call it a lipid bilayer cell membrane. You're looking at a protective little fat bubble. The fat bubble is where the DNA, the genetic material, hangs out, if you will, inside this protected environment. Scientists think that something like this is what helped the DNA molecule have a protected place where it can make copies of itself. So this gets right to the origin of life here. When you're talking about mutations and radiation, cells obviously divide. When you're looking at your school pictures from, say, first grade till now, you see yourself growing and getting larger. Even when you reach full height, full size, your cells are still dividing, replacing older, worn-out cells, and you're adding cells all the time. When we're looking at cells dividing, ideally you're talking about the DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid, the genetic material in that cell making a perfect copy of itself, being distributed to the daughter cells, being distributed to the cells as it divides. These cells will then grow, in most cases, when you're looking at usual cell division through mitosis. When you have a slight change in any of the genetic material in any of the daughter cells, that's called a mutation. And written over here, mutations drive evolution. You have to have a little bit of mutation, a little bit of genetic variety, if you're going to have any chance of changing the genetic material so that things, living things, can adapt to their environment. In the radiation study, we're learning about some atoms that are radioactive. If a cell gets run into, if you will, by alpha particles, beta particles, gamma rays, the products of a radioactive element, it can break the DNA. When the DNA is broken, now, a cell can handle a little bit in the way of mutations. Most mutations don't do anything at all. But if you have too much in the way of mutations, it can either kill the cell outright or it can cause cancer or other types of genetic abnormalities. And that's one of the reasons we're learning about it in here. Moving on to the second part of our documentary that we were checking out in class. This first part was a little history, a little of the sounded a little bit maybe doom and gloom on the history when it was talking about the 1930s and 40s, the early days of the race to get enough uranium together in one place at one time to get a chain reaction going. We're shifting gears a little bit today and talking a little bit about the radioactive elements that we use in science. One, to treat cancer. Two, for imaging, like a PET scan, for example, when a person is literally injected with a radioactive element, and that radioactive element then emits its radiation within your body, and a scanner can then pick up the images from that, and they can see what's going on in a person's body. They can image things like tumors, especially fast-growing tumors. And also the idea of half-life. Again, kind of a hard concept when you're just learning about the atoms, but to that end, we were doing an experiment, and I'm going to reach over here on my table and pick up some pennies. We were doing an experiment with pennies. Now, you'll see this in your book. There will also be an extra credit assignment available later on for this. But if we take all the pennies as, say, initially heads up, the pennies are supposed to represent individual atoms in an element that's radioactive. And if you start with them all heads up, we started with 10 in this class. So each hash mark here stands for 2 pennies. Now that's only 10 pennies, but as we splay them out, you can see very, very quickly if we take out, say, the heads up pennies or the tails up pennies, either one. We take out those at each roll. Statistically speaking, each time we should be losing about half of the pennies until we eventually end up with no pennies that are heads up or tails up. The point being, when you're looking at radioactive elements, if we draw all the little radioactive atoms that are within a chunk of that element, you can't put your finger on one and say exactly when that particular one is going to radioactively decay, but you can say for a group of them, it's fascinating stuff, it's a statistics thing, you can say for a group of them that we know after a certain amount of time, this is called the half-life, we know after a certain amount of time that half of them will have changed. Which half? We don't know, it's random. That's the amazing thing about it. Statistics is controlling this. But the last little idea on this was that different elements have different half-lives. And we take advantage of that. Certain elements like uranium have such incredibly long half-lives, 4.5 billion years, that you can use it to accurately date the age of our entire planet. Other elements have relatively short half-lives, and we can use that, for example, in medical imaging when we actually inject something with a short half-life into a human and then see what the radiation is showing us from the inside out. It's an amazing way of using radiation in medical imaging, and also we're going to talk a little bit about using gamma rays specifically to attack tumors. So while radiation can cause cancer, radiation is also integral. It's really, really important to fighting cancer by literally attacking just the tumor cells, not bathing the patient in radiation like we used to in the old days. Last little thing, check out online for this, but you can also look it up for yourself. When and where was the Chernobyl disaster? When did this happen? They talk about that specifically in the video that we're watching, the little clip that we're watching. And finally, this one right here, talked about it just previously. How are radioactive elements used in diagnosing and treating disease? That's where we'll leave it today. Look for the notes online and see ya here on YouTube. Bye-bye.